It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. So begins A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens, an English novelist you might have heard of. But actually, the full quote goes on quite a bit longer. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness, it was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity, it was the season of light, it was the season of darkness, it was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. You can see why it's the shorter version that people remember. Anyway, the book is about the French Revolution, that really fun time in history for anyone with fancy clothes and a neck. To be honest, I haven't read A Tale of Two Cities, but I was lucky enough in secondary school to be introduced to one of Dickens' best works, Great Expectations, and I fucking hated it. But I did read the Wikipedia article on the French Revolution, and my understanding of it is guillotines. Not very fun. You could even say that it was one of the worst times to be alive, unless you were poor, in which case you got to have a bit of fun. But this is an idea that pops up pretty often. This is the worst time in history to be alive! Or, hey, here's a list of fun moments in history that were really awful. I bet you feel better about your Doritos and TikTok now. But I don't deign to engage in popular culture like that. I was inspired to make this video by a tweet. Typer Durden, what a name, was the author of said tweet, and I'm going to read this pretty slowly because it has some difficult words in it. I'm pretty certain that every single era in human history would have been psychologically experienced by many as the end of the world if there'd been social media during it. There have been many eras in history that people experienced as apocalyptic, of course, but I really do think social media has a very dastardly way of amplifying an already common human tendency to register grief and destabilizing change as a horrible end of all things. In other words, if you run around in public like Chicken Little and cry, "The world is ending, the sky is falling, it's the apocalypse," people will probably just ignore you or call the police. But if you do it online and hide it behind a wall of sarcasm, you get like 10 million followers? I wouldn't know. I don't deign to tweet. Some examples of periods that might have felt similarly apocalyptic are the year 536, when a volcano erupted in Iceland, covering many parts of the world in a thick fog that lasted for 18 months and gave huge drops in temperature. People back then would have had no idea what was going on. And to make matters worse, in the year 541, the bubonic plague struck the Roman port of Pelusium. Not Pelusium. And speaking of the bubonic plague, the most famous outbreak of this plague spread through Europe from 1346 to 1353. We call it the Black Plague. And as you can tell, it was really fun. It killed 75 to 200 million people. In the present day, some people are already pretending that coronavirus is over, but back then people couldn't just ignore the massive effects a plague had on society. Things just changed much more slowly. I mean, these weird pointy shoes were fashionable in Europe for like 100 years. Now we just have Crocs. But of course, we can't talk about awful moments in history without mentioning the two superstars, World War I and World War II. I've heard they weren't great times to be alive. But all of these events were isolated moments in history, and depending on where you were, they might not have affected you that much, or at all. On the other hand, there are people living right now through famine, illness, and war. So maybe a better way of quantifying whether it's the best time to be alive or the worst is to look at the general level of suffering throughout the world. So, how do we measure that? One of the simpler ways is to look at the level of extreme poverty over time. We don't have statistics from most of history for obvious reasons, but we do know that since 1800, extreme poverty has fallen from around 80% to less than 15%. That's pretty great, right? And it's not just that. Child labour is falling. Children should be staying at home and playing Fortnite, after all. We have more leisure time than in the past, so adults can play Fortnite too. We're spending a smaller proportion of our money on food, so you can buy a second phone and play even more Fortnite. Life expectancy is going up, giving me more time to stretch out this terrible joke. And both children dying in childbirth and mothers dying giving birth are going down. Fortnite! But how are these things being measured? Not being in extreme poverty just means that you live on more than $1.90 a day, which isn't even enough to buy one item on Fortnite. Sure, we have more leisure time now than at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, but it's been shown that medieval peasants had way more free time than we did. And they got those pointy shoes. Life expectancy is rising, but are we actually any happier? This is where it gets interesting. Pessimism is much higher in the global north than in the global south, which kind of makes sense. If you live in a country where living standards are increasing, like China, Kenya, or Peru, it's probably easier to be optimistic about the future. Equally, a lot of social welfare systems in developed countries are currently having some issues. Humans also have a general bias towards negativity. Our ancestors had to be a lot more cautious than we did. Let's say you found a really nice place to drink water from, and there's a tree nearby with really yummy fruit on it. But every now and then, a group of lions visits the same place. You're probably going to prioritize avoiding the lions over getting a few juicy pears. Ah! Still, there are definitely problems we face nowadays that people in the past didn't have to deal with. We have a constant stream of technology shouting at us 24/7. We have a constant stream of politicians and commentators shouting at us through that technology 24/7. And there was something else. What was it? Oh yeah, the world's on fucking fire! And our shoes aren't even pointy. But I do think there is a strong personal element in how you view this all. You're probably familiar with Maslow's hierarchy, our pyramid of needs, essentially. Well, at the top, there's this thing called self-actualization. But what does that actually mean? The traditional layman's view of Maslow's hierarchy is that you move up the pyramid one step at a time. Oh, you're hungry? Well, you can't fall in love then, and you definitely don't need pointy shoes. With this understanding, only rich people get to worry about being happy, which doesn't really work. Like, you can be hungry and still feel a deep human need for love, just as you can fill your life with joy by spending all your money on Funko Pops, but still be unable to cook basic food. According to Maslow, self-actualization is the desire to become more and more what one is, to become everything that one is capable of becoming. The characteristics are efficient perceptions of reality, basically being able to judge situations well, comfortable acceptance of self, others, and nature, reliance on own experiences and judgment, being spontaneous and natural, having a larger goal in life, being independent, continued freshness of appreciation, basically getting excited every time those pointy shoes come back into fashion, profound interpersonal relationships, comfort with being alone, having a good sense of humour, peak experiences, you know, those moments where you just feel one with the world, caring about people, having few close friends rather than lots of casual friends, and Gemeinschaftsgefühl. Of course, there has to be a German word at the end. This is psychology. But don't worry, I'm fully trained in German. Yes. Oh, interesting. Yes. Ah, okay. Thank you. Gemeinschaftsgefühl means feeling linked to humanity. By the way, every time you cook an omelette, you are killing a German family. The first time I read through this list of characteristics, I thought, damn, I'm just an amazing person. At least according to Maslow, I'm very self-actualized. It's been a change that's taken many years to reach, but I honestly feel like I meet all these criteria and I just feel pretty great. I'm not even really joking though. This year I've got back in touch with my religious side and I just feel more optimistic about life. I think a lot of that optimism comes from these characteristics that Maslow described. A lot of people think that if you're optimistic and happy about the world, you must be naive. But I think of it this way. I see the pain that is in the world, I hold it in my hands, I let it flow through me, and I let it go. Because holding on to pain is not a way to get rid of it. Life should be full of joy. Whatever time in history you're from, wherever you're born, whatever your experiences are. Many things we can't control, but we're never truly powerless. I want to argue that this question of whether we live in the best time or the worst time comes down to your level of self-actualization. I'm not saying that it's everyone's individual responsibility, that pessimists just need to work harder at being happy. Fundamentally, I believe that in order to be self-actualized, we need to be interdependent rather than independent. In some ways, now is an easier time to be self-actualized than ever before. We worry much less about our basic needs being met. But in the modern world, we're constantly being isolated, pulled away from communities and the environment, and told that we just need to work harder when we're more productive than any previous moment in history. So I understand why a lot of people think of it as the end of the world, the last era of humanity. But I can't agree with that. I think it's an impossible question to answer when thinking about people around the world, but the answer you choose for yourself says a lot about your life. A Paradise Built in Hell is a book by Rebecca Solnit about the communities of support and interdependence that formed in the wake of huge disasters like the 1985 Mexico City earthquake and Hurricane Katrina. What she found in these disasters was that although there was a huge amount of human suffering, there was also a level of community that most of these people had never experienced before. Once things were back to normal, many of them found that they actually missed the time just after the disaster when everyone was working together and caring for each other. One of the most important things we can do to move past painful experiences is to grieve. Grieving is an active process. You face the emotions, you face the pain, and you swim through it. It hurts, and it's so much easier to just turn back. But if you do choose to grieve, when you reach the other side, the air tastes so much sweeter. Climate change is already causing death and destruction around the world, and it's important to grieve that change, to grieve the lost communities, the lost people, the lost habitats. But pessimism isn't grieving. It's imagining things to grieve. We spend so much time worrying that this is the worst time to be alive that we give up on imagining how we could make it the best. Thank you for watching this video. It was a lot of work, and to be honest, it's probably the hardest I've ever worked on a video project. If you're not already a member of the Patreon for my podcast, Easy Stories in English, you can join it for just $5 a month and get these videos 1 month early. Go to patreon.com/easystoriesinenglish. And to listen to my podcast where I tell short stories in easy English, go to easystoriesinenglish.com. Now, if you excuse me, I'm going to go eat a juicy German.